We're coming up to Christmas and we know that domestic violence increases considerably around the Christmas period.
What we see over Christmas, women just take a deep breath in and they try and hold it the whole way through. They're just coping. And what we will almost always see is in the new year, once the kids go back to school, we see a big spike in calls.
I want to speak a little bit about the Nikita Hand case because it's something that is in a lot of our heads at the minute. Where do we go from here?
I think what was really important in that case, the judge absolutely was clear in relation to consent.
Sexual violence is on the increase in this country and a lot of younger men are at the forefront of this. Mm-hmm. Do we know why that is?
The why of that tracks back to
Welcome back to the Laura Dowling Experience podcast. Today, I am absolutely honoured to be joined by Sarah Benson. Sarah has been the Chief Executive Officer of Women's Aid Ireland since 2019. Prior to this role, she served as the CEO of Ruhama, an Irish non-governmental organisation that works nationally with women affected by prostitution, including victims of sex trafficking. So with over 2 decades of experience in the community and voluntary sectors, Sarah has held various senior management positions. She has managed the National Domestic Violence Helpline and has extensive experience working both in Ireland and abroad, particularly with marginalised ethnic minority women and youth. She has also contributed to policy and advocacy efforts. She served as the Irish expert on violence against women for the European Women's Lobby Observatory from 2010 to 2016 and was the chairperson of CAP International between 2014 and 2019. My goodness, your resume reads like I'm going to go here forever. Additionally, she is a former vice chairperson of the board of National Women's Council of Ireland and is a current member of the boards of the Wheel, the Irish Court Service and CUAN, the National Domestic Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Agency. Academically, Sarah holds a Bachelor of Arts from University College Dublin, a Master of Philosophy in Gender and Women's Studies from Trinity College Dublin and a Master's degree in Business Studies from University College Cork, obtained through the Irish Management Institute. That's just up the road.
Yeah.
Under her leadership, Women's Aid Ireland continues to advocate for the rights and protection of women and children affected by domestic violence, working towards a society free from abuse. So that's blue skies, isn't it, Sarah? Mm. Welcome to the podcast. I am absolutely honoured to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I really am. I saw you speak at an awards event there recently. I said, I need to get that lady on the podcast because this is such an issue in Ireland, in the world at the minute. Mm-hmm. And we're coming up to Christmas and we know that domestic violence increases considerably around the Christmas period. So we want to shed some light on the work that you and your team do, how we can help women in our society, and then I suppose try and dig into why this happens.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure.
So Sarah, what got you interested in this work in the first instance?
I think probably there's a thread. I mean, sometimes you feel like you stumble from one thing to another, but when you look back in hindsight, there's definitely a thread around really feeling strongly about an equal society and feeling strongly where you see inequity and inequality. And I suppose as a woman, as a girl growing up, it became really clear that over half the population actually are in a persistent situation still, even in a wealthy, democratic country like Ireland, in a situation of inequality across the board. And I probably came to light most for me when my mother was canvassing for Mary Robinson as our first female president, and those issues were being aired, and starting to realise that, you know, circumstances, risks, how a girl walks in the world, how a woman walks in the world is a little different to how a boy or how a man walks in the world. And I suppose it's been kind of pulling that thread ever since, because I've never worked in an organisation that has exclusively done that frontline work. It's really important, but it's always included some aspect of social change, system change, of kind of progress, be it legislation or, you know, a public policy or just a better way of doing things. So that's where I started, and I suppose that's the theme that runs through, but particularly focusing on women and girls.
And where do we stand in Ireland at the minute when it comes to domestic violence and violence against women in general?
Unfortunately, and I think COVID-19 provided a really interesting kind of backdrop to opening up the discussion on domestic violence more than we ever have in decades preceding, is that it's always been there. It has been a shadow pandemic, was what we referred to it during COVID. But it's something that every single person in this country is touched by, whether they know it or not. There's no way, if you work in Ireland, that you don't know somebody, whether you know it or not, that it isn't something that has touched someone in your family or people's own lived experience, either as a child or as an adult. We have very recent research through the Fundamental Rights Agency and Eurostat that says that 1 in 3 women experience physical, psychological or sexual violence from a partner over their lifetime. We know from Women's Aid's own research with young women and young people that 1 in 5 young women are suffering intimate partner abuse by the age of 25, and 51% of that group are experiencing it first under the age of 18. So these are their first relationships. We do know it's a very gendered issue. That same study found that 1 in 11 young men suffered abuse as well. So it's not to say that it doesn't happen to men. The highest risk group would be women in heterosexual relationships. And it does, of course, also happen in LGBT relationships as well. So it's really, really prevalent. And it can be absolutely devastating. We maintain the Femicide Watch for Ireland, which is the record of women whose lives have been lost to violence since 1996. And just yesterday, we've had to add another woman's name to that list. So it's 268 women have lost their lives through violence, over half of them at the hands of a current or former partner. So it's a really high stakes issue.
Do we know why?
I think that it goes hand in hand with what I mentioned, is that if you are in an unequal society, it creates a greater vulnerability. We do know that an awful lot of abuse, the pattern of coercive control of abuse in intimate relationships, but also the exercise of sexual violence and control is really rooted not in sex, but it's in power. It's about power and control. And when we're talking about domestic abuse and intimate partner abuse, that really tracks back to very, very stereotypical traditionalist views of a kind of patriarchal way that relationships should be, which were fundamentally unequal, which is where, men dominate, men control the money, the entitlement to women's bodies is kind of enshrined in, once you're in an intimate relationship, questions of consent really didn't arise. It was 1990 in Ireland when rape in marriage was actually criminalised. And a full decade later, I think we only had 1 conviction under that. So we've more since. But that sense of that unbalanced relationship. So again, this is not to say that all men, but when you have 1 in 4 women in this country who experience it, there is a significant cohort of men who will choose to behave in an intimate relationship in a way that is not grounded in healthy behaviour, like compromise, like negotiation, like mutuality. Those are all the green flags in a relationship, what we refer to, but instead will exercise control, coercion in order to get what they want. And
so do we have stats from before? Like, do we know, are we getting better or are we getting worse?
It's really hard to say. Our earliest prevalence survey was a piece of research that was conducted by the Crime Council, which found that 1 in 4 women in Ireland were subjected to abuse. And as I mentioned, and that was data gathered in 2003. The research that I mentioned that came from Eurostat and the FRA has that figure now at 1 in 3. Compared to 1 in 4, it's not like for like. But at the same time, we also had this really comprehensive piece of work that was done by the Central Statistics Office that was put out last year on sexual violence and abuse in Ireland. A really detailed, far-reaching study that found that 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual violence from a current or former partner. So whether that is an increase in prevalence or an increased comfort in reporting, it's hard to say. It is something that has, with many things that relate to personal relationships, been shrouded traditionally in kind of secrecy, in shame, in stigma. So we hope, for example, that a service like ours, like Women's Aid, we are seeing year on year increases in contacts with our service. We know our colleagues whom our national helpline refers to across the country are also seeing unprecedented demand. And we also know that only a tiny proportion of those who actually experience domestic abuse will seek a specialist service. So that's only the tip of the iceberg. And we hope that that is not necessarily reflective of the fact that there's been a huge increase, but that there's more awareness that there's help there. There's more awareness that the shame should not be on the person who's being subjected to harm, and that support is something that people are entitled to, and that they are maybe more likely to reach out now. But we do know that shame and stigma is still really deeply ingrained, and in fact is part of the tactics of a coercive controlling partner, is to put the shame onto the person whom they are abusing, to make them feel that they're responsible, that somehow it's a lack in them, that it's their fault, that they could have prevented it if they maybe had behaved differently. It's actually it's a cornerstone of it. And when that's internalised, it makes it so difficult for somebody to say what's happening.
The shame word is a word that comes up an awful lot with child sex abuse survivors, with domestic violence survivors, with any rape survivor. And it is that shame that they feel that they should have, would have, could have done something differently. And you're just after verbalising that and saying sometimes that can be a reason why a woman may not reach out for help. And it's a tactic. And how can we change that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, people don't pick up that stigma and internalise it just from the behaviour of the abuser. And you've given a really clear suite of examples there, and you're absolutely right, because on the one hand, I was talking to a police officer there recently, and we were discussing different forms of abuse, like you've listed there: child sexual abuse, sexual violence, then you've domestic violence. One key component in many of those situations is that the behaviour, particularly if it's ongoing, if it's repeat harm, is grooming. People are groomed. But what supports somebody to behave that way is the fact that our social attitudes also reinforce what victim survivors might feel. That if I dressed a different way, if maybe I hadn't been drinking, and particularly with children, it is, they are so vulnerable, and often they are already vulnerable children who are targeted and groomed. Is that on the one hand, we have to really focus our attention on holding perpetrators responsible, but at the same time, we really have to be putting that social message out there, is that that's wrong. It's not a correct assumption that the stigma should not be on the victim, the survivor. It should be on the perpetrator. And so as a society, we have to increasingly really push back. And I think really good work's being done by, for example, our colleagues in the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, or the group Active Consent, and we're collaborating with a lot of colleagues around looking at really making that discussion on consent a cornerstone of everything we think about in terms of our interpersonal relationships, not just our intimate relationships, but what boundaries are, what consent is, and supporting people to have conversations around actually holding their boundaries, that's completely appropriate. No really means no, from children all the way up to adults of all ages.
Yeah. I was speaking with the governors in the prison recently, and they said sexual violence is on the increase in this country, and a lot of younger men are at the forefront of this. Do we know why that is?
There's no simplistic answer, but there are two things that I think we can signpost to, because we, in the context of our 50th anniversary conference there a couple of weeks ago, our partner Core Media did a piece of research for us, and we launched it, and it was around attitudes towards masculinity. And so they did a survey, a nationally prevalent survey of both men and women, but they particularly focused on the responses from men of all ages on their attitudes towards masculinity, manhood, relationships with women, their attitudes towards women. And what it found, building on work that was done by a group called the Men's Development Network a couple of years ago, was that on the one hand, we have 3 in 5 men, if you have a table with 5 men sitting around it, 3 of them will be more moderate in their views. So they'd be more likely to take a more egalitarian view around relationships, less concerned about, the fact that men need to have more roles as earners or, providers in relationships, more open to, considering matters around emotional vulnerability, more concerned about things like loneliness and connection. But 2 out of those 5 men are the very other end of the spectrum, very much espousing those kind of traditionalist views that I mentioned, very patriarchal views. What it is to be a man is to be dominant as much as possible in situations, use strength, never show weakness. Vulnerability is weak. Women's issues and women's opinions aren't necessarily to be considered to the same degree as, male peers. And in that 2 and 5, what was really striking, and it was probably the thing we pulled out of the report the most, was the fact that the majority, by a long chalk, of those who have those traditionalist views were the youngest men. So the 18 to 30 group. And the why of that, I think, tracks back to, in some ways, their probable over-reliance on social media as opposed to men in other age groups for role models, for their information, and where they will engage with their peers. And we also know through research that DCU did quite recently, looking at boys' engagement with YouTube and TikTok, is that it's not that young men are seeking out messaging that might be misogynistic or very traditionalist or really reflect and reinforce views, of an alienated male population, but the algorithms actively bring them down that rabbit hole. And so, YouTube and TikTok, the research showed, like, very, very quickly, was bringing boys down extremely dark misogynistic content. And they may have been just looking up their favourite football club or, a particular celebrity, but within a few clicks, suddenly the feed that's coming at them is really misogynistic. And it also is bringing them to the likes of Andrew Tate, who managed to game the algorithm in TikTok staggeringly well and has a huge following amongst 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, all boys. And then the other thing is pornography. And I really think when you talk about sexual violence, you cannot not talk about pornography now. And we commissioned, I should say, a piece of research that was published just over a month ago now, looking at the impact and potential harms of pornography, not just to gender equality, but also to children and young people, and how their developing sexuality is being impacted, but also around its impact and influence in both sexual violence and in domestic abuse relationships, but also in general, and contributing to really serious things like intimate image abuse, like the demanding of intimate images, and then the sharing of them without consent, which is a crime in this country. And it's a crime because it has had to be made a crime. And pornography is the thing that keeps circling back to. So that exposure, the ease of access that young people have to mainstream pornography, which is free, which is just fundamentally violent, degrading, absolutely doesn't depict a healthy sexual intimacy. And unfortunately, this is coming up in our colleagues in the rape crisis centres are seeing it here. They are now seeing a significant increase in male minors perpetrating sexual violence. In the UK, data around cases, criminal cases, and how many are now involving minors, boys, perpetrating sexual violence, and pornography is being named again and again and again in court cases as a significant factor. The horrific murder of Anna Kriegel would be one that really looms large, and that was a number of years ago, where pornography was front and centre in boy A's consumption and what happened and what was done to her. So we can't not talk about pornography.
No.
And if we want to talk about healthy sexual relationships, I think we have to really solidify that perspective that being sex positive has to be porn critical, because it doesn't contribute really anything positive to healthy sexual relationships, and instead actually it causes particular harm to girls, but it's also causing harm to men. It's causing...
Well, boys are seeing really violent pornography before they've even kissed a girl.
Absolutely.
And they think that this is the way they have to perform, and I'm assuming that the girls that are watching this too feel they have to do what the actress is doing as well. So they're almost led to expect that this happens.
Yeah.
So it's a two-way street.
Is. But what it is it's very gendered in how it is that boys are being told this is what they should do, and girls are being told this is what they should expect to have done to them. And yeah, you're quite right. These are sexual scripts that are being embedded at a kind of neurological level long before young people are even kind of, holding hands with somebody. And it's really disruptive. And I think it's really confusing. But it's also can become very compulsive, the use of it. And I mentioned, like, in terms of fertility and issues with impotence with men is on the rise amongst men in their 30s, and the direct line is pornography. And we know we've been working, whilst that research was being conducted, we've been engaging and convening meetings of colleagues across different sectors, so children's organisations, men's organisations, youth organisations, our colleagues in the domestic and sexual violence services, justice, to really start building that conversation on how do we address the challenges that pornography is posing, the harmful challenges. And there's lots of different ways of looking at it. There's no magic bullet, but education and trying to create an alternate narrative, so healthy relationships and sexuality education, but also support for parents to have conversations.
And that's it. You see, because parents don't really want to have a conversation and say, oh, the porn that you see or that you're seeing, or it's almost, it's a bit cringy or it's a bit embarrassing. So, but I think those conversations need to happen, because porn seems to be here to stay. Like, could there be a blanket ban on it? I doubt it. Yeah. So, like, it'd be wonderful if there could be, obviously, particularly the violent stuff. And then there are people that support it because they support it for healthy relationships. But I think it boils down to when people are seeing this violence all the time, it's just dangerous.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the answer is.
Well, there are answers, and but there is, as I say, there's no magic bullet. There's no one thing, and so it has to be a multifaceted approach. I think the first is to have this conversation, which is going to be a challenge, because particularly the male population, a huge proportion have consumed porn. So we have to be careful to have the conversation in a way that isn't kind of shaming and blaming of what has happened before, but it's more like understand actually that the stakes are really serious here, and that this doesn't actually contribute to healthy relationships at any age. And there are efforts that are being made in other jurisdictions. This is also a multi-billion euro almost unregulated industry. And it's also really important to note that the actual trade itself, the porn industry itself, it is not the case that it's acting in the stuff that you see, the stuff that's open source. That's being done to women largely. So what is being depicted, extremely degrading, violent, that isn't put on. That is also actually happening. And the issue of sexual exploitation and trafficking within the porn industry, and the fact that a huge proportion of the content now is actually user generated. So what that means is it's not necessarily being filmed in a studio. It is a subscriber is putting up a video of their partner or their girlfriend, and so there's been class action suits in the United States where you have child victims of sexual exploitation whose exploitation has been completely proliferated across mainstream porn sites. But the other thing is that those mainstream porn sites, and we could probably trot off a few of the names, but that's not where an awful lot of it is now. It's on X, it's on Discord, it's on YouTube. So the mainstream platforms also have responsibility there. And there are things like age verification that are being explored in some jurisdictions. Australia has just done something quite remarkable in relation to social media in general, where they have banned social media use for under 16s. And what they are doing is they are making the sole culpable party, the actual social media platform. So the challenge is in 12 months, they have to find a solution to find a way to block access for under 16-year-olds. And it's, it's being vaunted as maybe a little unrealistic, but what they're actually doing is they're saying, you guys are making billions. You are not open to regulation. The self-regulation isn't working, but you can find a solution, and the fact is these algorithms that I mentioned, this is the business model of these platforms, and they are doing harm. They are doing harm by exposing young people to pornography, by exposing young men to deeply alienating content, stuff that is tapping into further generating loneliness and feeling that somehow young men are disenfranchised. And for girls, it's quite gendered. They're being dragged down rabbit holes that encourage eating disorders, that are, reinforcing beauty myths and beauty stereotypes that, can be really deeply disturbing and internalize that very traditional, and that causes huge issues with self-esteem and other things. So in the round, there are things that we have to be courageous to look at, because as one activist mentioned to me recently, like, this is an entire generational social experiment. I did not grow up with the internet, but my children have never not known the internet. I didn't have a mobile phone until I was in my 20s, but I was a late adopter. But
I was the same.
But my kids, they were always there. I remember when my kids first went and just swiped their fingers down the telly because they thought that they could change it by swiping.
Or they freak out when an advert comes on the telly because they're so used to, non-adverts and streaming.
So that level of exposure, that level of, there's wonderful things, of course, from that. But young people's entire social lives are, an amalgam of online and in person now. They can't switch it off. So it's kind of incumbent on us now to really, really make it safer for them. So, I do think there are things that can be done, but they have to be multifaceted. So I say legislation, education, and you mentioned earlier, sorry, I went off on a mad tangent, but you did mention, and I think it's really important, because one of the things I come across the most is, and I have a son and a daughter, is the how on earth do I have this conversation? How on earth do I open this up? And I don't want to necessarily mention porn in case maybe they haven't seen it. And, there are really good resources out there. And in fact, one that I will give a particular shout out to it's called Culture Reframed. And so this is Dr. Gail Dines. She's the author of a book called Pornland. She's spent decades kind of doing research and campaigning on the harms of pornography. She would be totally pro healthy sexual relationships and has seen just how damaging this is, including to men. She worked with men in Wheelock University, and in terms of their sexuality, the fact that they couldn't maintain intimate relationships because their reliance on pornography had just disrupted their neural pathways. So they couldn't have, build healthy, meaningful relationships. And
some of them can't have sex with a real woman as such, because they're so...
Absolutely, yeah. But then if they are, they maybe are trying to enact pornography on women, and including strangulation and things like that, which are just outright dangerous. Women are dying. But she has a website which is culturereframed.com. Or .org, Culture Reframed, and they have open source resources for parents, and now they have open source resources for teachers, which are based in research, but they are about how to have conversations with your kids at all ages, so from tweens through teens. And I've directed people from the Department of Education there around the curriculum, just around these being resources. It's just so helpful, because what has been found, and educators or people who are working with youth who have stepped into that space, the minute the conversation is opened up, is young people are desperate to have the conversation. They are confused, they are unsure, they are frightened, they're making assumptions about what their peers of other genders are thinking, and somebody giving them the space and holding the space to let them just say what they're worried about and ask practical questions is such a relief to them.
They're saying children as young as 9 are accessing pornography.
Yeah, and younger, yeah.
So I think that assuming that your child hasn't seen it is probably not true. I think you should probably assume your child has seen it and then have that conversation rather than maybe the other way around.
I think that is a fair assumption. But then there's that sense of paralysis of, oh my gosh, what do I do? And actually, I think it's kind of, and I don't mean this in any kind of a harsh way, but we do have to get over ourselves as the older generation. Like, we just have to get over ourselves because the kids really want to have a dialogue about this.
Yeah.
Provided that it isn't telling them that they're being bad or that they've done something wrong. It's to have that open conversation, just saying, well, young people, when you think about, or when they talk about what they actually would like in a relationship is, it is like that things of like, having a kiss or holding hands or, and that starting point for a relationship is around getting to know somebody and obviously having, that kind of warm feeling in your tummy. Pornography just obliterates that. And it makes them think that the thing they have to go straight to is, really aggressive sex. That's terrifying. But it also obliterates the idea of a relationship and assuring them that actually the former is the normal and that's how people, and that's the way to go. And you may not have sex for years and years and years, but you could have lovely intimate relationships, depending on your age, is to just feel comfortable to be able to open that up with
I
kids.
think even just starting off saying you may be seeing things on your phone with people naked having sex. It might be violent, but that's not actually what a loving, healthy relationship looks like. People make love, and just starting that, you'd be surprised what they come back with. It's very interesting. Kids are very resilient as well, and like you said, they love that. If you can have that open conversation in your house all the time, and it isn't just the one conversation.
Yes.
It's many little conversations, isn't it?
Yeah, you're dropping little breadcrumbs and hoping that they'll pick them up. Or sometimes it's you see something on telly and it's around starting a conversation. Just say, well, what do you think that was going on there? And what would you think about that? Is that, and it's also a way of also asking them, is that something that you and your friends, do you ever talk about that? And, I think, not to be too stereotypical about it, like girls can sometimes be more open to those conversations. Boys are just like, what, but just kind of hang in there. And, and that's where also that question of role models comes in as well. I mentioned Andrew Tate, and he's like the bogeyman, but he's absolutely abysmal. I mean, he's currently facing sex trafficking and rape charges. But he's not the only one. He's one who's managed to game the TikTok algorithm magnificently. But we have to look at other positive role models. Young men look for other men as role models. And there's loads of them out there, but they aren't necessarily getting the attention that they need. And there is this lauding of a particular kind of masculinity as success, and often it's coming up in sports. But then you look at other amazing sports people who, they're just low key because they just do their sport and they don't have the bravado. And Conor McGregor is a prime example of just one of the worst examples of that. But we have to be careful, if we're going to say something isn't necessarily the best role model to look at, we have to be able to offer an alternative. So just saying, this guy's bad or he's toxic or, we have to show the other side of the coin. So that's a lot of our work, particularly our campaign, our 2 Into You campaign, which is a specific standalone kind of website and campaign and project for younger people. So it uses very different language to domestic violence, and it talks about intimate partner abuse. But what it has is it has the relationship quiz, which has like the green, amber and red different signs in a relationship of what's healthy as well as what's not healthy. And also those things that are kind of maybe a little bit of a warning sign. And we have adults who are going in, using it and saying this is actually great because it's that early signs of what's possibly moving into being maybe an abusive or a controlling relationship. But at the same time, you're also saying, but this is what you should be looking for. Respect.
And if we get them early, boys and girls.
Absolutely, yeah.
They can go through life then understanding what is the red flag, what is the green flag. But you mentioned Conor McGregor there, and it'd be remiss of us not to mention him and the case that's just happened. But I also want to mention other, not very great role models. And Donald Trump being one of them. Like, he has openly said he grabbed a woman by the pussy. He's a convicted sex offender.
Same as Conor McGregor, a civil case.
And it boasted about how he likes to grab women by the pussy. And he's being lauded now as a hero by many frustrated males. And I was watching something online there just before you come up, and it was about men in in relationships on Tinder, and the fact that women are choosier now. We don't have, we're well educated, we have our own jobs, we maybe have high ambitions for ourselves. So there's less men that fall into a category that we would find acceptable. So then there's a group of men then that feel that they're undervalued. There's a group of men online that are called the incels. They're men that can't have, they can't find a woman to have sex with, and they're women haters and that. So there's this underbelly of women hatred as well, as a result of these role models that say this is the way you have to be, this is the way you have to act. And it just seems like it's gaining momentum more and more.
Yeah, it is. And I think some of the kind of stats looking at the voting public in the United States was showing that younger women were pulling majority more liberal, but younger men were pulling much more traditionalist. I wouldn't even say it's conservative. It's that real traditional, stereotypical patriarchal structures. It's kind of like it's almost like a retreat back. And it feels almost like there's an overcorrect happening, but that does happen. I mean, like, we are not at equality. Equality actually, for men as well as women, when they kind of lean into the benefits it gives in terms of really healthy relationships, freeing up men to be more authentic as well, in their diversity, but that has established itself as something that is being kind of put out there as a bit alienating, is that, well, women only want strong men anyway. If you're not earning, you're a loser. Showing weakness is, pathetic. And that's the message that men in the manosphere are putting out there, and it's being internalized. But the difficulty is, if somebody has already kind of internalized that there's a sense of entitlement, then behind that, they're not necessarily going to have success with women who are quite right to feel that, and Tinder is, an interesting example. Obviously, there is a lot of women on Tinder, but an awful lot of women I know who have been on Tinder came off it a long time ago, because all that the men on there appear to want is a hookup, and they don't want that. They would like a relationship, but a relationship that's grounded in, having shared interests, having conversations, shared values, shared goals. And that is a healthy, equal relationship. So it's kind of what people maybe want from those sites may be different. And I don't know the study you mentioned there, but if it is the case that some are, are saying, well, it's not working for me, so therefore it's the fault of, the person who is rejecting me, that is a projection out. And maybe it would be more useful to say, well, how is it you're putting yourself out there on this site? And what is it you actually want? Because if you just want a hookup, you can't judge people for not wanting a hookup,
Yeah.
And if you want something different, maybe go on a different site, but it will require a bit of work on yourself and a bit of self-awareness. And the incels, again, is a prime example of pushing the fault out on women. Deeply
Andrew Tate's
misogynistic.
managed to do that.
Yeah. I mean, he very unabashedly styles himself as a professional misogynist. I mean, he does not hide it. So, it is worrying, as I mentioned. Like, that report showed that of the 2 in 5 men in Ireland who reported really quite worrying views around, domination, that, women's issues are exaggerated, that you shouldn't always have to take women's views into account. The majority of them were young men. So we do have to find some way to redress that.
Yeah.
And there is that thing of, I touched on it and I would like to circle back to it, is that idea of what's in it for men to actually, create an even or more even playing field. In Ireland, we still have really poor political representation of women at business, at the highest levels. We still have a gender pay gap.
Sure, even women that are in political parties, the amount of abuse that they receive.
Yeah, and it tends to be very sexualised abuse.
Yeah.
It's not that I know some male politicians who've got absolute grief as well, but with women, it has the added factor of also being really sexualised abuse.
Like, I'm going to come and rape you.
Exactly, yeah. And we need a critical mass to ensure that the way we, approach our society, our systems, our structures, our legal systems, you need a critical mass of women in there, because they are looking through one lens and, men are often looking through another. The other big elephant in the room is the disproportionate burden of care. So even if women are full-time in work, They also are, in the majority of cases, holding a disproportionate burden of care for the home, for children, for older parents. And that stifles their opportunities. But also at the same time, we would love to see, we talk about childcare. We would love to see more paternity leave available, but we'd also like to see men taking it, if it was there. So I think we need to also focus on where there's a real benefit to men to be able to kind of push outside of that stereotype. Is like, well, you can't afford to take time off work because, your salary is higher, probably. So if the pay was equal and the opportunities to participate as parents, or in other areas of life were kind of evened out, that actually can reduce a lot of stress on men. It would enhance their opportunities to build their own relationships with their kids. I'm not saying that there aren't amazing dads out there, but the fact is there's only a couple of weeks paternity leave. A lot of men don't take it. Or they won't take the unpaid leave. So there's the other thing is around, young men and boys, internalizing those messages it is giving them such a narrow path. Whereas, if they want to explore their sexuality or if they simply just want to show emotion, the message they're being given is like, well, maybe anger is the only acceptable emotion. And that's so inhibiting. But there's something about recognizing that, to allow boys and men to be their authentic selves, if they could shuck off this, Teflon, almost cliche kind of profile, the likes of what McGregor would put out there. And of course, he's the extreme, but, to degrees, that's what's coming out in terms of what young men think they ought to be like or they ought to value. It's a lot rooted in materialism as well, is that actually, having stuff instead of having friends and friendships, that are meaningful, connections, we know that that's a challenge. And this really does feed into mental health as well. And, we do have a mental health crisis in this country, and it affects women, it affects men as well, though, and in some cases really acutely in terms of suicide and things like that. I really think that if we think of this holistically, that it's win-win,
Of course, and it shouldn't be women against men or men against women. It should be, we should all be looking at it together. And, based on recent events with Conor McGregor, he has and he will continue to, I suppose, suffer serious reputational damage, okay? There's advertising contracts been taken off him, etc. From here in Ireland, certainly. But, I was reading something in the Irish Times, and apparently it's less likely to happen in the US because he'll be, accepted there with open arms. The head of the UFC, which is the organisation under which he fought for the so many years, Dana White, he was caught on camera slapping his wife in a nightclub in a bar. We've already discussed Donald Trump, who was actually, victorious post-election win. He was having a great time, high-fiving Elon Musk and, hanging out with young super male sports stars like Bryson DeChambeau. So it seems, they're going the other way, and it's going in a completely different direction. And I say that, but then you're giving me stats like the 2 in 5 men and the way they traditionally think, and then also the 1 in 4 women that are experiencing this in our country. And it is really frightening. But what I would like to ask you is, the typical woman that you see, is there a stereotype? Is the woman poor? Does she not have a job? Is she dependent on her husband financially? Or does this cross all realms of society, of creed, of everything?
When it comes to all forms of gender-based violence, and in particular domestic violence, the single biggest risk factor is simply being born female, no matter where in the world you are. And it absolutely, we refer to it as the most democratic of crimes, because it can happen to any woman in any socioeconomic group, any faith, of any ethnicity. What I will say is 2 things. You can start out, and I've worked frontline for many years, and I will have spoken to women who in some cases are still operating at a really high level, perhaps in business, and what they are managing to do is extraordinary, because they are managing to survive and maintain their job, but at the same time, the lights might only be turned on in the room where their partner is. The heat is only turned on in the room. He controls all the money. I've spoken to women who have said there's a lock on the fridge that he has the key to. You just you never know. And what happens then is that there's also that emotional component, which is wearing somebody down. Like nobody walks into a relationship and experiences somebody being really obnoxious or even physically violent early on and, would tend to stick around. It is, I mentioned the word grooming earlier, and it is really, coercive control is a grooming mechanism. And what it does is it just starts to shrink somebody's world, shrink their options, isolate them from their family, from their friends, but also isolate them from themselves by just messing with their head so much that, and I've heard far more than one woman say this to me, is that even if he's not in the country, it doesn't really matter because he's still in my head, and every decision I make, every thought that goes through my head is filtered through how is he going to react to that? What will be the consequences if I do that? Should I wear this? Should I go there? Should I see this person? Should I spend that money? And that is the impact of coercive control. So it can diminish the person who is targeted to the point where they hardly recognize themselves. So that absolutely is a consequence. And if you are in a country and you are an ethnic minority, or if you're in Ireland, if you're an ethnic minority, or if you do have, less financial means, or you have a disability, or you're from a minoritized group, in terms of your sexuality, society itself then, and its different inbuilt barriers and biases can make it harder to both seek support and safely exit a situation. So we talk about an intersectional approach when you're talking about kind of responding to providing support for or to try and prevent domestic violence, is you first have to look at that gendered issue and make sure that, women are more likely to be in low pay, for example, more likely to hold the burden of care. So the consequences for many are different. To, for example, men who experience domestic abuse, the risk of physical harm and death is much higher for women as well. So the stakes in that regard are higher. But then we have to look at, okay, on paper, anyone should be able to go into the court and they should be able to seek protection. Anyone should be able to apply for housing or should be able to try and get a job. But that isn't always the case. So if you're a migrant woman and you don't fulfill the habitual residency condition, if you don't speak the language in this country, if your family are all in another country, it is harder to actually access support. So it can create additional vulnerabilities for certain groups, whilst at the same time, the fact is anyone can suffer.
Okay. But you see it across the board. It doesn't.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And ages as well. Women into their 80s contacting us, and sometimes young girls. And we have a maternity project, which was a pilot project there for the last few years, which combined kind of co-creating specialist training for frontline kind of midwives, obstetric health. But also we piloted a direct referral outreach for the Dublin hospital. So we now have 2 outreach workers who receive referrals directly from medical social work in the 3 Dublin maternity hospitals. And what we see there is sometimes very young women who are pregnant. And the other thing with a relationship is a coercive controlling relationship is that one of the tactics is to lock somebody into a relationship quite quickly. So what you will see with some relationships is they go very fast and it seems very romantic and someone's literally swept off their feet, but then they'll be cohabiting and then they'll be sharing the bills and then, early pregnancy in a relationship, like quite early in the relationship, not necessarily very young, but what you see is somebody and that is one of the key ways to lock somebody into a relationship, is to create a dependency. Also, they're more likely to not have financial means. And so it's a really particularly vulnerable time. So what we have is this fast intervention for women who are pregnant or just postpartum. And a lot of these are very young women, and they will be more likely to be more vulnerable where there's maybe mental health or risk of homeless, or they maybe, have a precarious immigration status. And so what we see in those situations is that you really need to kind of up the ante in terms of creating a holistic response, because those will be the more vulnerable. It will be just harder for them to navigate the situation than maybe somebody who has, access to more means or has citizenship or, is still suffering terribly because it's very damaging. But the more additional vulnerabilities you have, and so we see that particularly when we look at the women who are coming through that are, a real cross section of women who have very complex needs, and really, really need that support and empathy to get through, along with their children as well.
And did I read somewhere that a lot of abuse can start when the woman becomes pregnant?
Yes, I mean what can happen is certainly it can escalate, and
do we know the reason why?
Well, yes, in a sense, because it makes sense. In some cases, the reason is because the attention is drawn. And really, when somebody is behaving, so a perpetrator of coercive control, it's all about them. It's all about what they want, when they want it, how they want it. So it's this entitled way of engaging in a relationship using pressure, coercion, manipulation, rather than discussion, compromise, negotiation to engage in a relationship. And, when a pregnancy occurs, of course, the focus can shift. It also can escalate because a woman is more likely to be seeing health professionals. And that obviously is an opportunity for disclosure. So escalation of threats, escalation of coercion so that somebody is less likely to disclose through fear is one as well. But we also horrifyingly know that when there is abuse, and if it escalates to physical abuse, it's also actually specifically targeted at the abdomen, in many cases. So,
oh my God.
Yeah. So it's really disturbing. And obviously, again, this is in cases of abusive relationships. But it is such a vulnerable time. So that's why, and working with, the maternity hospitals is one example. But another example would be, we're trying to look at developing something with one of the large homeless organizations, because often you have domestic violence, and the couple may be in homeless accommodation, but how to support a family in that situation, support the victim survivor in that situation, requires everybody playing to their own strengths, and creating that kind of safety net, so that Women's Aid can play our role, the key worker in the homeless service can play their role, because there may be other competing needs and priorities in that situation. So yeah, it is. It's circling back to the question you asked me at the very top, is just how prevalent it is. It is something that, we're about to form a new government here.
Are we though? It looks like kind of the same government.
Well, it'll be a new old government, but one of the things that we'll be really anxious to see is the continuity of the commitment to the National Strategy on Domestic, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence, because this is a justice issue. It is a social issue. It is a public health issue. It's a public health crisis. The cost of it is enormous.
It really is. The cost of it for, just take one demographic out of it, the cost for the children that are witnessing that dysfunctional relationship, because it can't be functional, and whatever they're seeing is going on, because they are seeing, they're hearing. Even if you think that they're not, children pick up on so many. Isn't it body language is 90% of language, and they're witnessing this and they're thinking that this is how relationships are, and then they're growing up thinking this is how I act in a relationship. So even just from that point of view, it is so tricky, isn't it?
It is, and I would go further in that, like both TUSLA and the World Health Organization officially recognise, and we would wholeheartedly concur, is that being in a home where there is domestic abuse, children are not witnesses. They are actively experiencing the emotional abuse by being in the environment. And very, very often, if coercive control is being perpetrated by one adult against the children are also actively being coercively controlled as well. So, if you think about it, children feeling that they can't bring their friends home, children feeling like they're walking on eggshells, like it isn't that they are just there, they are suffering as well. It is directly impacting them. It has consequences for them. we touched on an absolutely staggeringly awful case before we started recording, which occurred in New Ross, where you have a child, which what is being reported is that she stood in between, her father and her mother. And, obviously that case is proceeding, but, that wouldn't be unique. And yes, it can impact lifelong, but children are extremely resilient. It is not inevitable that living and growing up in a home where there's domestic violence, that either girls will be more likely to suffer it or boys more likely to perpetrate it, provided that they are given support to see other ways of healthy relationships. And we have male supporters as well as, female supporters, and so many of them who are our donors or who work with us in other collaborations will say that the reason is that they grew up in absolutely terrified of their father, and so really conscientious, fantastic, supportive men, can come out of these homes. So there's no inevitability. But
that's really important to say, and it's important to say to people listening now as well, if they are in a situation where they're in a domestically violent relationship and they know their children are witnessing it, that this isn't to throw guilt on you, or more guilt and more shame at all.
No, the responsibility is always on the perpetrator. Yeah. And actually, certainly with women we work with, so many of the women we work with through our face-to-face services, a huge amount of our time is supporting them through the courts, and it's the family law courts, and children are a tie that binds until they are 18, sometimes 21, and it is used actively. So post-separation abuse is really real. And
I've had some questions in about that.
Yeah, and we have women who are facing the real proposition of, do I trade safety for homeless? Do I trade safety for poverty? And do I also do that for my children? And it is an astonishingly difficult thing to navigate. But the crucial thing is, and we have a dedicated training centre, and we would do training with social work and many others, including a session on children. It's so important that the response to support children is also focused on supporting the non-abusing parent, because they also are managing to live with abuse that's targeted at them, often managing to kind of hold body and soul together, get the kids to school. Like, the day-to-day survival of managing is astonishing sometimes, when mom herself is being completely put upon, is frightened, is, trying to juggle, economic abuse, where there's degrading situations where they're, having to, in some cases, not uncommon, trade sex for money for groceries, things like that just happen that people aren't aware of. So it's absolutely crucial that we don't focus, on blame being apportioned between the two parents. The blame is on the person who is abusive. And I know sometimes you can have relationship difficulties, and there's sometimes this reference is very vague and it's not very helpful. It's like couple conflict, and that is where you get that throwaway phrase of there's the two of them in it. When we're talking about domestic abuse, it is not that. You will have resistance, but what you also have is a really off-kilter power dynamic. So you have one person who is, when you're able to step back and see the wood for the trees and look at the patterns of behaviour, is actively manipulating the situation, or is the person who is controlling it. But they also will be manipulating everybody in the environment as well.
That's the thing. And I wanted to talk to you about that, just a little bit of a touch on it, because I have spoken to women who they're separated from their partner, but their partner is still controlling them because they may have visitation rights, and the visitation rights are enacted and they have to stick by them. And mum arranges for dad to come and visit and take the kid on a Saturday, and mum arranges that's her day to work, and then dad doesn't turn up because he knows she's working, and he knows she'll have to call in to work, and dad doesn't seem to care that she's not earning the money, but the fact that he can control her through the visitation of the children and just not turning up when he says he will, or when she might have a night planned out to go out and enjoy herself with her friends. It's that control that he has over her, even when they're not living together anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
And the courts don't help it.
No, there's a big piece of work underway. It's called the Family Justice Strategy, and there's a huge range of undertakings around reform of the family law courts. They are not operating well. Women's Aid have actually commissioned, and it's well underway now. Trinity College are doing a really far-reaching piece of research looking specifically at how adult and child victim survivors of domestic abuse safety and well-being is addressed in the context of custody and access proceedings, because what we see again and again and again is that there may even be domestic violence orders in place. In some cases there's criminal sentencing, that is not attended to in the context of custody and access proceedings. And this circles back to the point I was making, which is so key, is that if one parent is abusing the other parent and the children are in that home, the children are also, at risk and being subject to, at a minimum, the emotional abuse of being in that environment. And there is a historic presumption that somehow that is divorced where women will say, well, the judge didn't want to hear this because they're saying, well, he may behave that way to you, but he's a really good father. That doesn't follow, that is not effective parenting to abuse the mother of your children. And if they're in that home, we also know that children are being impacted, and the work of people like Dr. Emma Katz and others have been really to the fore in properly centralising the experience of children. And we are seeing that the voice of the child isn't necessarily heard or isn't necessarily vindicated, and it is in law that it should be a key part of that. The other aspect of that is post-separation abuse. Like, children are actively used and manipulated in that situation, and sometimes it causes them terrible stress and anxiety. So on the one hand, you're quite right, custody and access proceedings themselves and arrangements are used, cancelling at short notice, not turning up. But on the flip side, if maybe the child is sick and mom says, look, they can't come today, they're sick, she then gets a court summons for breach of access because she hasn't honoured it, even though, reasonably the child is sick. So that we see the weaponisation of the courts themselves.
Yeah.
Women being dragged back and they have to take time off work if they're working, or, they have to get childcare. It is exhausting, it is expensive. But also what happens with children is children will be used to ask, well, is anyone coming to the house? Who's your mom seeing? Who's she talking to? Where have you been going? What have you been doing? And used on, as an ongoing monitor. And children know that that's happening, and it is incredibly stressful because they're being asked, to divide their loyalties.
I know women who
yeah.
hide online orders for clothes they needed from their children because they know that their ex-partner will be asking, and then use that against them and saying, you're spending the money I give you for the kids on yourself.
Yeah.
Like, it's multifaceted, isn't it?
Maintenance is not paid. Court-ordered maintenance is not paid in a staggering proportion of cases. At least 30% of maintenance is never paid. And what has been really punitive, particularly where women are struggling financially, because they maybe are full-time caring for the children and so can't work full-time, they may have to have recourse to social welfare. As that social welfare was, up until quite recently, means tested against maintenance that often wasn't being paid. And women had to go back to court to prove, which meant they had to go back to court to prove that it wasn't being paid. Now that's shifting, where that means testing is recognising that, you shouldn't, like the small amount you're getting to live on for social welfare shouldn't be docked on the basis of maintenance that isn't even being paid.
Yeah.
That persistent ongoing ways to kind of punish and control is common, and it's more common where there's children together, because that's a key mechanism to do it.
We've talked there about separation, but there is, are there figures as to how many times a woman needs to leave a violent relationship or a coercively controlling relationship before she actually leaves? I've heard 14 times bandied around, or different
there's
numbers.
No one number. What is true is that it is exceptionally difficult. You can get locked in really easily. I mean, the flip side is why don't perpetrators of abuse just stop doing it? Because it is a choice. It is. These are people who often operate extremely effectively in all other aspects of life and can choose, to behave, perfectly well to other people. So, the easier thing is that somebody would choose not to behave that way in the first instance. And I think it's a question that, all eyes are on the victim, and what she or they should and could be doing. Whereas, very often it's, the victim and the children who have to leave the home, flee to a refuge, perhaps, which is only ever a temporary situation. They have to find the alternative accommodation, so I think we could make it a lot easier if we really thought, a bit more laterally around how we hold perpetrators to account. And in fact, there are, legislative moves underway around kind of giving Gardaí more powers around removal of, a perpetrator from the home, so that it isn't the case that they're having to drive.
But by their nature, these perpetrators are violent in some cases, and also they've put fear into these women.
Well, I think the other thing is just on a practical basis, this is not the same as, a stranger, who you've never met before, behaving violently or behaving abusively. This is, firstly, a hugely emotionally manipulative. It's a huge betrayal of trust, so people are drawn in, they're love bombed, that's a really common way to draw somebody into an abusive relationship, shower them with attention, with affection, then withdraw it, which is a way then to actually pivot it so that the person who maybe wasn't even that interested in the first place is suddenly feeling that they need to make more of an effort and make more of a running. Like this, it's hugely manipulative. If you then share hopes and dreams, and maybe, the person is quite manipulative and isn't always awful. They shift the goalposts constantly. They keep you on eggshells constantly. If you're financially locked in, if you have a shared mortgage, if you've given up your job, if you have children and the children are settled in school, it is not that easy to extricate yourself. And also, physical abuse does not have to be a component of a really damaging, particularly coercive controlling relationship. But the fact is, in the UK, for example, they know, because they undertake things called domestic homicide reviews, is that sometimes the first act of physical violence is an act of fatal violence, because this is about power and control. And somebody who will perpetrate that behaviour invests very heavily in creating things the way they want them. They have maybe sex when they want. They have the house as they want. They have whatever's cooked the way they want. They have children behaving the way that they want, if there are children involved. And if they think that that's going to be disrupted, that there's a threat to that, if a woman gives any indication that she may be thinking of leaving, or takes steps to leave, or actually leaves, that is the most high risk time in an abusive relationship. And the first act of physical violence can be an act of fatal violence. So risk is also really important to keep in mind. And a lot of the work that we would do and our colleagues would do is around discussing safety planning, how to safely consider planning an exit. And women will leave and they will experience hardship, and suddenly, the charm will come back on, or, maybe an order, a temporary order is applied for protection, but before the full order comes in, promising the sun, the moon and the stars, everything will change, and drawing somebody back in, because, an awful lot of the women we speak to are just really kind, generous, open women, and they don't necessarily want the relationship to end. They just want the awful behaviour to end, and they want to have hope. So, that's quite a convoluted way of saying this is really not simple. It
is not simple. And, you're giving all the examples there of how someone may be more dependent on the abuser than the abuser is on them, and how difficult it is to extract yourself from a relationship when you have, children, you have a mortgage, and you have all the rest. And, I have a good job, my husband has a good job. It'd be very bloody difficult to separate and divorce. Yeah. Because you have to have two homes then, and you have the even just the financial impact on people.
The housing crisis at the moment, and actually I was managing the National Domestic Violence Helpline when the last big recession happened, and it was catastrophic because you had couples who were trying to separate the cases we were dealing with. These were cases where it was a dangerous home. It was a fearful, threatening home, but there was just nowhere to go. And now rent is, off the charts. Refuge, as I mentioned, is only ever a temporary solution. And our colleagues in refuge are almost perpetually full because there's nowhere for women to go, and women are going back because they don't have any other options, So this is where this, feeds into all areas of public policy. Our national homeless strategy, the Housing for All strategy, does not have a gendered lens and does not mention domestic violence at all. And there are things that could be done at local authority level. It's completely inconsistent, around being able to apply outside of your area, being able to apply even if your name is on a mortgage because, perhaps that home is just not safe. So recognising that, that shouldn't be an impediment to applying for a local authority house. So having a proper gender perspective on homeless is really important. And it is
interesting because when you mention homeless, and you've said it a number of times, people have a preconception about what a homeless person looks like. But a homeless person can look like you and I.
Yeah, it could be a family sleeping on, granny and granddad's couch because they've nowhere to go. Yeah. And there is that hidden homeless piece, and it is a really significant factor in female homelessness. I mean, there is a higher proportion of men among the homeless population, but when women are homeless, a history of sexual and domestic violence is an extremely high factor for causing or being a factor in women's homelessness specifically.
How can people who suspect there is abuse in a home, whether it be coercive, physical violence, sexual violence, how can they help their friend or their loved one? Because that's been some of the questions that have come into me is like, I suspect this, or she's admitted to me, but she won't leave. She says she can't leave. How do we support our friends or loved ones that we might suspect be in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. It's one that we get asked a lot. The good news is you do not have to be an expert and you do not have to have the solutions, because really at the end of the day, if you want to support and empower somebody you care about, you just create the environment to help them think about what they need. I mentioned our national helpline, and the number is 1-800-341-900. And we would always say that our helpline is, and it's 24/7 every day of the year. It's for anybody who's suffering domestic abuse, but it's also for people who are worried about others. And we get calls from dads, from employers, from sisters, from friends saying, I know. And there's that expressed kind of paralysis is like, I just don't want to do the wrong thing. And it's hard to do the wrong thing, if you create that open situation where you're not feeling like you have to have the answers, but that you just open up and listen to say what is going on. And having that conversation can be really hard to start. Creating an environment where somebody is like, they're not at home and, their partner's about to walk in the door, things like that. So, reaching out to somebody and, arranging to go for a walk or arranging a cup of coffee and just kind of gently opening up the conversation, just saying, I notice you don't seem yourself anymore. Or I notice, you've been a bit preoccupied, or, I notice you don't seem really happy. Is there anything going on that, that you'd like to talk about? And just let them speak.
Would you bring up the fact that you suspect that there's domestic abuse going on, or do you just start off with, I notice you're not yourself, or do you come out right and say, listen, I know that you're being abused?
It can be a really confronting thing for somebody to be faced with kind of a statement or something like that. And one of the reasons just to be careful a little bit about that is part of the manipulation is that it's quite common that somebody who is, has an abusive partner, that partner will really try and target and create a negative perspective on the people who are most likely to support. So it's like, oh, your mom hates me anyway, or your friends don't like me, and try and pull a loyalty. It's just say, well, it's better if it's just us, and I prefer you wouldn't see them because I know they're only going to badmouth me. And they put their partner, your loved ones. Yeah, they put their partner though in the situation feeling they have to defend the person who's abusing them, because as I say, it's quite complicated. There's a lot of emotional manipulation often. So coming out with something confronting may unwittingly be validating what the abusive partner is already saying is like, oh, well, they hate me anyway. They'd say anything to trash me, and they just want us to break up, and they so that can be kind of what's going on in the back of the head. So I think it is better to create more of a blank canvas situation, just to say you don't seem very happy, or whatever it is you notice, without putting a label on it. Because sometimes it might not be the case that they're in an abusive relationship, but they may be suffering depression, or there may be other things going on. So that's the other beauty about it, is it's never a bad conversation to have.
Okay.
If you're worried about somebody, if you happen to be worried about their partner, that's a really good, motivation to open the conversation up.
Are there telltale signs?
There are, and I think one of the easiest ways to think about it is, and that possibly is also a good conversation starter as well, is, and that might be the way of slightly treading into the fact that the relationship might be a factor in what you've noticed, is if you think about somebody before they were in the relationship and now, what has changed? And sometimes it's like, you don't dress up like you used to, or, I noticed that, you're not out anymore, or you don't seem interested in the things you used to be into. So whatever it is, it's obviously going to be different for different people, or it's just, but to try and do it, the more you start listing things, the more you can risk getting into someone feeling that they're being blamed for something, like they've been a bad friend or a bad sister, or, so really just trying to go for the feeling sense is usually the most helpful one, because that's just getting straight to, it's like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling at the moment? Rather than listing behaviours. But if you're trying to think in your own head, I'm Jane's my friend. I'm a bit worried about what's happening with Jane. How do I sense check that? Was like, well, how was Jane before? And what am I noticing that's different? What is it that's changed? What is it tangibly that I'm worried about? And there can be things, if you notice, the other things that can be warning signs is if you're out for a night out, and I've had this in my own peer group over years, different people, where it's like, about 9 o'clock, somebody starts getting phone calls and getting texts, and they start becoming distracted, and they will always pick up the phone, they'll look, and then they'll be like, oh, look, I'm going to have to go early. Some reason has come up. Maybe there's children. It's like, oh, they can't handle kids, or it's something else. Something else has come up, something to disrupt the night, feeling, somebody being hypervigilant to things like that, messages coming in, or saying no and making excuses not to come out, or and also just changes in the way they're behaving, and somebody often. The consequence of an abusive relationship is that people's self-esteem can be dragged down to the floor. Like people are told, belittled, they're told they're stupid, and people take that on, and there's something that's like, you just don't, you don't seem to have your usual kind of confidence and sparkle. Is there anything going on? I'm only asking because I care. There's no just, but like, is there anything you'd like to talk about?
I had a woman message in and say that her partner, so whenever she is going out with her friends, or tries to go out with her friends, her partner says, oh, well, makes her feel guilty about it.
Yeah.
Even though she doesn't go with her friends very much. So she works and minds the kids, and then occasionally she'll, and she says it's actually just too much hassle to go out with her friends, because he'll just huff or be grumpy, or say, I want sex immediately before you go out, and just, so she's like, she's given up. That's coercive control, isn't it?
Really common. Yeah. And that would, that manipulation, and also that making it seem like it's the person's own decision. But the fact is they're deciding that because the consequence of them exercising their free will to go and see their friends is just that it is made so painful and so unbearable, not being spoken to for a week, or or being berated, or being texted constantly while you're out going, who are you with, or I want you to FaceTime me because I don't really believe you are where you are, and it becomes not worth it. But the consequence is that you're then at home and you're not seeing the people who could be a support, who could validate you, who could build you back up again. And absolutely, that is quite a common tactic that we see.
Is it premeditated on the abuser's part then to take them away from their family? Or does it just kind of happen very slowly?
It's that thing of, is it conscious? Is it intentional?
Is it conscious on the abuser's part as well? Or is it just something that builds up?
Well, you can have something that, I think this is where it loops back to that thing I was talking about earlier, that this is rooted in a perspective on the part of some men that that they are entitled to behave a certain way in a relationship, and that it is effectively okay, you know, that they should assert a level of authority, and that their opinion perhaps should be more important. And so it's not to say that it's fully conscious front and center, but it is coming from an internalized belief system that they are entitled to behave this way because that's how they feel their relationship should work. And then the behaviors and the tactics that come out of that are whatever particular behaviors and tactics work in order for them to achieve the relationship the way they want it. And usually that's a relationship that is not one that involves a level of trust, you know, equal respect in terms of opinions, in terms of the roles and responsibilities in the relationship. So an awful lot of it is that kind of an internalized, hardwired, kind of very patriarchal attitude. But it's not to say that somebody is consciously going, oh, now she's going out, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. It is that the behaviour flows in order to get the outcome. The outcome is, I don't think she should be going out. I mean, I think that that's a waste of time. She's the mother of my children. I don't want her going out dressed like that. As an example, like that's more likely the internal narrative. And then what you do to prevent it might be to make it just not worthwhile. Or if she does it, is to be really genuinely feeling completely, you know, irate, is that, you know, that she shouldn't have done that. She's crossed a line there, you know, because that's how I think this relationship should work. And I think that is, you know, I know there's different work with perpetrators, and, you know, the fact is men can change, you know, but it's a choice. It comes down to choices. And when you look at kind of the content and kind of perpetrator engagement programs, the first thing has to be a motivation to change. And often it won't be to save the relationship that they have just destroyed, because it's too late. But it might be for the next relationship. But what our colleagues...
Do perpetrators come and looking for help?
Well, sometimes it's a part of maybe, you know, there's a court order, and, you know, we don't actually run perpetrator programs ourselves, but some of our colleagues do. But the fact is there are certain men who are what's referred to as, you know, completely unrepentant about what they do. Completely unrepentant. They are never going to be candidates for that kind of work. But the fact is it still comes down to a choice. So if you're unrepentant, you still think what you're doing is okay. You know, Andrew Tate being a prime example of that, like, you know, on steroids almost. But that there is a significant cohort who are actually okay with how they're behaving, and they will burn through relationships, or they will, you know, wear their partner down so much that they become a shadow of themselves, but he's happy out. And our colleagues in Refuge will say that those who've worked maybe over a number of years is that you'll have different women coming in and you will realise that they have the same partner over time. So,
oh my goodness.
You know, so you do have repeat offenders. But then when men or just simply choose a different way, it is around recognising and taking responsibility, seeing, you know, the inequality and the power dynamics that they employed in their relationship, and discussing ways to materially change that, to change the patterns of behaviour. And they are hardwired, so it's not, like I say, what's the word? Unconscious competence at being a coercive controller.
Okay.
Like, it's there, and that needs to be very consciously put out on the table, identified as, okay, well, that's not a particular pattern of behaviour that is serving me well, so I'm going to change it. But the crucial thing is that they have to see the value in changing it. And if you don't care too much about, you know, really deeply about your partner's right to equality and respect, and if you feel more strongly that you are entitled to have things the way you want them in a relationship, the benefits may still be felt to be more weighted towards continuing to behave that way in other relationships. So it's like, if you get what you want and you don't really, you know, and not much is going to be asked of you because you set down, you know, these lines, and you've exerted sufficient different tactics to keep somebody there, to make sure that they don't step out of line, that they are behaving the way you want, you know, that can be considered a win, provided you don't care too much about your partner. Those are people who won't necessarily change their behaviour.
We're coming up to Christmas, and we deliberately are doing this podcast because we're coming up to Christmas, and Christmas can be a time where there is a huge amount of phone calls to your organisation, as well as the Rape Crisis Centre, as well as ISPCC. Why does this time of year strike up an awful lot of these issues?
It's funny, every year we actually always put out a press release on about December 18th because we always are asked these questions. And the easiest way to answer it is that what we see over Christmas is, firstly, in terms of our helpline, the few key days over, kind of Christmas, Stephen's Day, will tend to be quieter, although we'll be there 24/7. They'll be quieter because what's happening is, it's like I was described, it's kind of like women just take a deep breath in and they try and hold it the whole way through. They're just coping because everyone's in the house. People are off work. There is no real respite. There's family coming. There's additional pressures. There's financial pressures. The children have expectations. If there's children, doesn't have to be where there's children. I mean, Christmas can be just really painful. And so women will cope through Christmas, and what we will almost always see, not even always see, is in the new year, once the kids go back to school, we see a big spike in calls.
Okay.
And very often those calls are, this was absolutely horrific. I really feel like now I need to take some steps because it can be such a pressure cooker. And that's what COVID was like. COVID was like Christmas all the time because everyone was in the house, rubbing up against each other. The children were not in school. People were not in work. And so that's what Christmas is like. And also it is a real opportunity for escalation of abuse, because the children can be used as emotional tools with, financial abuse, is that there won't be Santa. I mean, one of the things we do every year, and we literally just sent them all out now, we're very organised this year, is we've sent out to the women who are actively benefiting from our service, from our face-to-face service and our high-risk support project. So women who were engaged with on an ongoing basis, we've sent out 30,000's worth of vouchers, like one for all vouchers, and we'll give more if women have more children, and basically that is to allow them. It might be Santa, it might be to buy the turkey, but it might be to pay for some of the oil so that they have heat over Christmas, or to allow her to pay the bills and then use that for Santa, and she can control that, because that's when maintenance won't be paid, for example, or it'll be delayed, and maybe then dad will rock up with a gigantic present but mum will have given nothing, so even post separation it can be a really difficult time. But when it isn't separation and people are in homes together, it can be really, really difficult. There's that thing of having to manage visitors, all sorts of things. So it's really, really difficult. And then what we see is that exhalation of breath and picking up the phone after Christmas.
And is obviously the more boozing that people do around Christmas, does that have an effect on it? And do you see an increase in phone calls to your organisation after big, I suppose, celebrations such as Christmas, Easter, rugby matches?
Yeah, there is a correlation around sporting events and things like that.
I remember in the UK they put out something about
the red card.
Oh my goodness!
Campaign,
yeah, it was, and it was there a World Cup recently or something like that?
It was,
England were not
qualify,
that was it,
yeah.
and it actually they put out saying this is actually a really, really dangerous time for a lot of women.
Yeah, I think what's really important is to put this in context. Okay. So alcohol doesn't cause domestic abuse. It is a disinhibitor. Your team losing at football, doesn't cause domestic abuse. But what it is the situation where somebody feels that they can lash out at somebody, when maybe they are feeling aggrieved or, upset, and the person who will be the target is the person that they are already abusive towards. So it's not like this is like comes out of nowhere. There will always be other patterns of abusive behaviour, but you may have points of escalation. But to be very honest, very often there are excuses really to, to maybe escalate physical violence and things like that. Alcohol absolutely is a disinhibitor. But what I always found really interesting, speaking directly to women myself, would be like, well, describe their behaviour. Okay, so did he start a brawl in the pub? Did he attack the taxi driver? Did he attack the guy who was walking the dog as he was going down the street on the way home? No, he waited till he came in, closed the door, and then went completely bananas. That is actually a controlled act, because you're choosing when and where you want to exert force and dominance. And then the next day it's like, oh, did something happen? I don't even remember,
That happens where they pretend they can't remember.
Yeah. Or, I'm so sorry, I was out of my mind, I would never normally do that. But then when you start to talk to somebody else, okay, that was obviously really serious. And, and that's also where sexual violence, as well has to be, put in there. If there's coercive control in every other room in the house, there's going to be coercive control in the bedroom, and it's something that's very difficult for women to talk about.
Because of the shame.
Yeah, and also it's that he's my husband. And sometimes it is, again, it's a little bit like that scenario. Of course, sometimes it's really aggravated, rape. In others, it's rape through coercion. So it's like badgering somebody until, or it's not going to be worth my while if I say no. There'll be other consequences. So it feels like, well,
they'll be angry,
I didn't
the kids,
say
they'll be
no,
grumpy.
but, I'll be getting the silent treatment for weeks, or I'm not going to get the grocery money tomorrow if I don't, So it's complex, and it's really important.
People will say that they take it out on their kids as well. They can be grumpy and nasty, and so they might as well just do it.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus. And so that is coercion, that isn't consensual sex, that is, putting somebody in a situation where it's a choice that's not really a choice, because they're presenting really horrible consequences. So, absolutely alcohol, absolutely, big high profile gatherings, things like that, where there may be alcohol, but usually they are treated as disinhibitors. But I would always say, when you start to have a conversation, be very rare that you might say, okay, well, then during the week, is it that everything's absolutely fine? Would you, if you ask what seemed like quite benign questions, it was like, well, of course he has control of the money, he earns more. Be like, okay, so if you though wanted to take out €100 from the account because you identified something that you'd like for the home or something like that, how would that feel? And you often get a pause where it's like, well, actually, no, that probably wouldn't be okay, because he also decides how the money is spent. So if it's supposed to be an equal partnership where everyone brings something to the table and things are negotiated, it will be the case that, you have plenty of primarily women, not exclusively, who might be, not in paid employment because they're giving all their time to caring for the family. But it will be absolutely fine. There's a joint account, and they're empowered to make decisions because it is a partnership. In an abusive relationship, if you ask that question and somebody pauses and they really can't see their way to saying that they couldn't see it, not being problematic, or there being a confrontation or an accusation that, that she doesn't know how to handle the money and that he needs to control it, like that's when you start to go, okay, is this actually an equal partnership?
And is that financial abuse as well? I've had messages in from people saying, their husband will go through every single item that they have spent. They have to ask for their tampon money.
Yep.
And sometimes it's refused and have to wedge toilet roll into their knickers.
Yeah, because that's a degrading act. It's a form of humiliation. Absolutely. We also have women who the petrol in the car will be controlled and mileage will be tracked. So it's, you said you went there, and that will actually be monitored. So it's not just about the money, it's also really heavily controlling where somebody goes. So you have enough money to get to the supermarket and back, or enough petrol. I remember years ago, going back way, and we were talking about this. This is not something that is distinguished by class or socioeconomic, is that I spoke to a woman and we were arranging refuge for her. She was driving a brand new Mercedes. She was living in a gated community. I won't name the area, but like it would be rated, it would be well known as somewhere where you would assume like it's all affluent, very affluent. But of course it meant that there's a lot of distance between houses. The gates are locked. Nobody knows what's going on. The refrigerator in this house was locked, and she knew she was probably going to run out of petrol before she could get to the refuge because he monitored how much went in. And so She did. She rang and she still had to walk a little bit before she actually got there in the end. Because the brand new Mercedes had run out of petrol, but nobody would have known. It would have been to the outside world. This woman has everything. She had control of nothing.
Yeah. My goodness. I want to speak a little bit about the Nikita Hand case, because it's something that is in a lot of our heads at the minute. I think that people were following the court case. We didn't really know which way it was going to go. People may have thought that the odds were stacked against Nikita winning her case because of the alcohol and the drugs that were involved. And again, it's that shaming of women for getting drunk or looking a certain way, etc. Now, she has won her civil case against Conor McGregor, but the costs of her own case might exceed, any kind of damages she got there. And obviously it was a civil case. The DPP decided not to take it on because they deemed that there wasn't enough evidence, or there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, and they wanted a Loctite case. So it would put women off going and seeking out the courts to actually be able to tell their case and stand up, because I think she was very brave to have done what she did.
She really was.
She absolutely, just in terms of there was an awful lot at stake for her. So it seems very unfair, doesn't it, that so much is stacked against the person to whom the violence was enacted on, and then not, because someone might be a celebrity, loads of money, they're lawyered up, they can just throw money at it. I don't know. I just don't know what to think about it. I just think it's where do we go from here?
But I think everything you've just described is true, and yet she still had the courage to do it. She went for it and wanted her truth to be out there, and wasn't willing to be paid off, wasn't willing to accept that, and it was found in her favour. But we also know that only a small proportion of reported sexual assault and rape cases actually make it through the criminal courts, because we still have this persistent issue of something happening behind closed doors, there's no witnesses, how do you prove, and even though we have a law that is based on consent and lack of consent, the traditional default is, there has to be some visibility of injuries or something to show that there was resistance, whereas actually that's, even though the law recognises that freezing is a really common occurrence when somebody has been subjected to sexual violence, is kind of like as a survival mechanism, and so becoming completely still
disassociated from your body.
Absolutely, because the fear then is I'm going to be raped, and I'm also going to be extremely seriously physically harmed as well, which is absolutely a risk. Does make it difficult, and so cases like that, on the one hand, one hopes will give courage to other survivors of sexual assault and rape to come forward. Court won't be for everyone, and we also know that an awful lot of people who are subjected to sexual violence tell nobody. We know that about a third of people who suffer domestic abuse tell nobody. Sexual violence, I think the statistic is higher in terms of people who don't even tell someone in their circle what has happened. So I think if we're going to move forward on this, we have to first make sure that we are creating a community environment where somebody can say what has happened, and they won't be second guessed, and they won't get questions that are reckless as to how they might land, that can really feel victim blaming. And that hopefully will then also be contributing to the system itself, because if it's a jury, the jury is coming from our community, and they are the ones who will be making the assessment. I think what was really important in that case, the judge absolutely was clear in relation to consent.
He absolutely was.
Absolutely clear in that consumption of alcohol, consumption of drugs, in fact, were a significant factor in somebody not being able to consent, as opposed to somebody opening themselves up recklessly
Asking
to
for it, yeah.
Exactly, and that was really important. So it's really important to have judgments like that made public. Other judges take heed of that, other legal professionals. We have had a lot of work to do over years where, you know, we had that really notorious rape case where, you know, the particular form of underwear that, you know, a woman was wearing became suddenly, you know, up for discussion as though that was a factor, you know, what she was wearing under her clothes. And that was being pushed by the defence, you know, so there's still work to be done.
I don't understand how these defence barristers take these cases either, but that's another podcast entirely.
Might stay silent on that. But I think the thing is, like, we still have, look, we have a really patriarchal system. It is one that traditionally, we have a society that has traditionally policed women's bodies. And that holds women and men to completely different standards, you know, across the board when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to parenthood. You think of, say, a teenage couple having a child, you know, the assumption being made on what young mom is going to do. She's maybe going to give up college, future career education. But the young man is not being held to the same standard at all, or the same expectations around co-parenting. And isn't it great maybe that he'll see the child at the weekend, but he has his life to live. That is genuinely the most common way that falls out. And then when it comes to sex and sexual engagements, you know, a young woman who has, you know, freely explored her sexuality, that will be something that's up for trial. Whereas it's just not even considered in terms of a young man. And we do have men who are subjected to sexual assault and rape as well. And you would not necessarily have the male victim survivors' sexual history, you know, being dragged out in the same way. But I think there's improvements been made.
Why is that allowed? It seems...
It is ingrained.
Outrageous.
Yeah, it is. And look, sure, there's a whole other issue around counselling notes, which the defence can subpoena.
How is that?
I frankly, at this stage, think it's inexplicable. And there's been talk for a long time.
The victim, when they go to counselling, the defence can actually ask for the counselling notes and pick apart those counselling notes.
Yeah.
So
I mean, to say it has a chilling effect on, I mean, I think, you know, it also means that just, you know, therapists working in that sector probably don't take many notes because, you know, but just the knowledge that that could be the case in the kind of, in what's supposed to be this kind of sacred space of trust and healing from trauma, that it could be weaponized, you know, it's so wrong. And the Minister for Justice did say that there was going to be changes brought in, but they haven't been brought in by the end of this government. We, you know, we really hope it'll be something that'll change.
How long ago was that said that it'll be brought in?
A matter of months ago, yeah.
Okay.
So it's, you know, it's outrageous that it would happen. But it is that idea of the burden being so much more on the victim to prove it as opposed to the defendant to defend it. It can be off. Remembering that when you are involved in a criminal trial, if you're the victim, you're not the victim in the trial. You're a witness. You're a witness to what has happened to you. And it kind of removes a layer of recognition for the person who has been hurt, who has been harmed, you know, even changing their, you know, title to even alleged victim just to witness. They are a witness, but they're not. They're the person who's been harmed, you know. And even legal representation, particularly in sexual violence cases where it can be so adversarial, you know, you have an automatic right to legal representation if you're the defendant, but not necessarily if you are the victim. I think that is changing now. I'd want to check that, is that you can, but because you're a witness, and yet your life can be torn apart. And we do have in camera for sexual violence cases here. The difference with Nikita Hand's case was it was civil, so it was fully public. And the echoes of the Belfast rape trial were so clear. Except in this case, also the victim survivor was named, you know, and our colleagues from the Rape Crisis Centre were there with her, accompanying her through the process, and you know, saying that the whole back wall was just flanked with journalists, just pointed at her, and so it really does reinforce the level of courage that it took to do it. And I think it's really important also to recognise that after these cases, the trauma of the case itself compounds often the trauma of the experience.
Of course.
there's a real need to recognise the need for ongoing support and therapeutic support, and also to protect the person going forward, you know, in terms of the public eye and how they are treated by the media. And, you know, sometimes we did a report in 2019 on domestic violence survivors who had pursued criminal proceedings. And even where there had been a sentence and a conviction, the majority still said, having gone through the process, that they weren't sure or that they wouldn't go through it again because the process was just so hard.
It's so long, so arduous. Like your mental and your physical health is at stake anyway, having gone through it already, and then to live through it again in a court and have your integrity and your whatever you stand for picked apart. And we know it's picked apart. You referenced it about the woman's underwear, about any number of sexual partners you may have had. If you were drunk, what were you wearing? What pictures were you sending the person you were asking for? Like it is this rhetoric. Like we're living in the 2024, but yet it seems that we could just be transported back to the 1950s the way we're talking. Although that judge, he was fantastic. The way he handled
on the
that.
record, which is great, you know. And I mean, we've seen it also where we've had, you know, senior members of the Gardaí give statements after coercive control cases where they have been really excellent and emphatic around, you know, it doesn't have to include physical abuse, you know, to encourage people to come forward, to report. In some cases, the perpetrators have been guards themselves and they've been prosecuted. So we are seeing kind of positive shifts. And there's been really important legislation brought in, but the systems themselves are, you know, move slowly, and at the same time we have that pull back. It's like a riptide with, you know, why is it that the double standard persists? It is because things like pornography represent women in a certain way, and it's prolific, you know, and those stereotypical attitudes lead us to those continued stereotypical judgments that are made of women and those double standards.
A couple of women wrote in to say they have been victims of sexual violence in the past and they never reported it to Gardaí. Should they do it now? Or is it worthwhile? Is there a point?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I actually was in conversation with somebody not that long ago who we did connect to make a statement to the guards in relation to a historic incident. And the guards were really open to it. They took the statement, you know, they opened a case file on it. Whether it will proceed to a prosecution or a conviction is open, because it is something that happened quite some time ago. But in this instance, the person who had experienced that sexual assault, what they said to me, and this is just one person's experience, is they really just felt validated being able to tell their story, having somebody take note of it. They were realistic themselves that it might not necessarily go anywhere, but it also meant that, you know, the perpetrator was probably going to be interviewed and they would know that somebody had told, whether it went further or not. So I think that that's a really personal decision for somebody. I think it also depends who the perpetrator is. You know, is it somebody who's still in your community? You know, is it a family member? Things like that. Those are all important factors. But I would always say, if you're not sure, if it's sexual violence, you know, maybe pick up the phone to our colleagues in the Rape Crisis Centre. If it's in the context of domestic abuse, please pick up the phone to us and just have a talk about it in the round. Rule nothing out. And our experience of the Gardaí in this instance, now we did particularly contact the Specialist Protective Services Bureau as opposed to just the local station, because they would be more likely to have the training and perspective on victim support in cases like these. So, you know, that I think is an important factor. But I would never rule it out, because sometimes just the telling of it and telling it to a state authority is freeing and validating.
This person actually said, or one of the people wrote in, should I just report it so it's on the stats? So, you know, they can add it in as another statistic.
Yeah, the other thing that keeping in mind is if somebody has been subjected to sexual violence, it is possible that the perpetrator has perpetrated it to others as well, and it can be a part of giving information to the guards that might be useful that they don't even know about, in terms of there may have been another complaint about this person, and then suddenly you have two. And then maybe, a pattern emerges. So you just don't know. I think it's important information for the Gardaí to have. And who knows where it goes. So again, deeply personal proposition. If somebody really wants to sense check it, contacting one of our those two national helplines, because you don't even have to give your name, and you can really just open it up and toss it around and look at it from all sides and then make your decision. But we'd never shut somebody down on that kind of a question.
Now, this next question is, I'm not sure if this is a racist question or not, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The elephant in the room, the increase in rape and murder due to unvetted migrant perpetrators. Okay.
So this is something that's kind of bubbled up in maybe the last 2 years in discourse. And to be very honest, it's something that we find usually in the context of broader kind of protests against migrants. And you mentioned the word racist, and in some cases outright racist commentary. And it is coming in some cases also from individuals who are kind of putting forward, the safety of the women and girls of Ireland as a motivation for, anti-immigration sentiment. We don't really buy it, because often that the same people who are saying these things also are the ones who are saying, that women shouldn't have, reproductive rights, or very, that, they should be protected to stay in the home, very traditional views. But I think what's really important is just to factually, for the record, state that, the perpetrators of murder in this country are overwhelmingly Irish men. Of course, there have been some migrant men who have perpetrated murder, and migrant women have died as well. We have diverse communities here, and as I mentioned before, domestic violence happens in all communities without fear or favour, unfortunately. The word unvetted, though, I think is something we're paying attention to, because what exactly is vetted? If you think of our community, and we say 1 in 4, 1 in 3 women in this country, no matter where they have come from, but who are in this country, will experience psychological, sexual or physical violence from a partner. And we step outside this house and we look down the road, left and right. We don't know who is in each of the houses. We don't know what's going on in that situation. And we certainly have no record of vetting of our neighbours or our partners. I enter into a relationship. Do I get a certificate of vetting from the person? It is a concept that is designed to other and differentiate, but also distract and deflect from the fact that there are plenty of perpetrators of domestic violence in this country who were born and bred here.
Okay. I've had a load of messages from people to say this is a similar type of comment, not a question, but Women's Aid has been an amazing support to me, and I really just wanted to thank them. Oh my goodness, I feel like crying. Like loads of those little messages.
Oh, that's wonderful
which
to
is
hear.
Just lovely. So a number of people want to know what is the best way to get involved? As in, is it money that you need? Do you need donations of clothes, of baby clothes, of bibs, of food? What do you need for people to help you?
Well, firstly, it's lovely to hear those messages. I think it's really moving and touching. And we have our 50th anniversary this year. And over that time, we did a kind of a calculation, and we realised that conservatively we've had over 600,000 contacts with women over that time. So many generations of women. And in terms of support, we have worked with amazing survivors who have shared their stories. That's something that has been a part of our work ongoing. We do raise funds. We are lucky to get statutory funding for some of our services, but over 50% of our running costs are from fundraising. So if people would like to donate, any amount, large or small, is always extremely welcome. And we have our website, womensaid.ie, which has a donate button. Sometimes people like to actually get involved in like a fundraising activity as part of that, and we do have some. We have one that I'll be doing, I'm bracing myself for, is our Nullag Naman, our cold water swim on January the 6th, where we'll have women and some men jumping in the sea all around the country. So you can find out more about that on our Women's Aid Facebook or on the website. In terms of giving goods and clothes, we don't provide refuge. We have a wide range of services, including the National Helpline and the High Risk Support Project and our court support and our training and campaigns and things. But if you have goods like that to give away, we would always say find out where your local domestic violence refuge is, because often they can benefit because they have children and women coming in a residential setting. And if people aren't sure where to find them, they can ring our helpline, the National Helpline, 1-800-341-900. We can find out where they live and we can direct them to the local refuge service in their area if there is one. So that's always welcome. And yeah, join our campaigns, even just be active online. We have Women's Aid is online. Also our young people's campaign, 2 Into You, is on Instagram. It's on that one's on TikTok. And
I'll share all of this in the show notes as well, and
so,
link it all.
Just so much of doing podcasts like this, and thank you again for taking the time to meet with me, is around spreading that word that, we all will know somebody. And look, one thing I would say anyone could do, provided they're comfortable and it feels safe to do so, is to put the Women's Aid helpline number in your phone. Put it in under some particular title, because you just never know when there might be a moment where somebody or maybe you yourself might need it. And just having that referral pathway. I said early on that we know that the women who contact us is only the tip of the iceberg, and all of the support services. And one of the reasons is that they don't know that there are services out there. We'd love to think that we are universally known, but we're not. Or people don't think we're for us. They think there has to be physical abuse, or they think there has to be absolute crisis. No, early on in relationships where things feel bad is a great time to pick up the phone and start to sense check things, because information is power, validation is power. Somebody being able to say, well, actually what you've described is not normal, healthy behaviour that would fall into the definition of abusive behaviour, can be incredibly powerful for somebody to hear, because it validates what they have been feeling in their gut all along. Okay.
Any unusual new tips for women staying safe in different situations?
Ooh, that's a very wide open one, isn't it?
So,
because I know there's a lot around public safety as well. So again, this really, it's this kind of catch-22, isn't it? On the one hand, part of me just wants to always say, why do women keep having to manage our safety? Because we're not the ones we're frightened of. It's why is it that some predominantly men choose to seek to harm women, and that should be our focus. And when we think about things like, we've been in discussions with the guards around kind of, public safety planning, and, talk about lighting and things like that. And it's like, well, it's not the dark that women are afraid of. It's who's in the dark, and that's who we need to focus on. But at the same time, the reality is there's also that need to, I never know how to answer this in a way that feels satisfactory, but I do think that there's maybe a different question is to, I think when Aisling Murphy was murdered, one of the things that in the huge public outpouring came out was a lot of men saying, what do we do? How do we become part of this conversation?
Well, actually, that was my next question. What can men do to help prevent violence against women and girls? So that answer.
So the two dovetail. These two dovetail, and because the things that women do, and I'm always staggered when I say it to men, and I even ended up saying to my own husband, and I was like, "But you know this, right?" And he was like, "No." It's like, well, of course, we'll walk with our keys in our hand. Of course, we'll make sure we walk on the side where it's light. If possible, I'll be texting someone, I'm leaving now, so you will expect me in, X amount of time. So I think that part of the way women keep themselves safe is that they have conversations with men to explain how it is to be in the world, vigilant always to the possibility of male violence, because it isn't a case that we think all men are violent, but the problem is we don't know which one might be. So you have to be vigilant in all situations, and that is a lived experience that I've realised to my surprise, most men don't actually understand. I think the more men understand how unsafe women can feel, the more what they need to do is actually be part of active allyship and active bystander engagement. And that means like sitting back and saying, well, I'm not that guy. That's not enough. That's, that's less than doing nothing. That's taking a position of, not being part of the solution. And that means, hearing and listening to the women in your life and understanding, that they have a perspective that you maybe need to engage with so you can understand what the stakes are. But also amongst your peer group, we know men listen to men, and it's, it's not necessarily, that calling out misogyny and things like that. But actually, I find a really good tactic, which I got from a man in a company where I was doing one of those fireside chat things. And he had this brilliant suggestion, which I've used and shared, everywhere since, is if somebody says something that's degrading or sexist, and if they say it as a joke or as a comment, instead of kind of confronting them with it in a way that they can go, well, you just don't have any sense of humour, or you're just whatever, is to say to them, I don't get that. Can you explain that to me? Because it means that the person has to explain why something really, really sexist is funny or, is an appropriate comment. And this goes for racism and homophobia and anything. Yeah. It's a really disarming thing. But if men do that more, I think that it starts to shift the cultural assumptions that it's okay, this casual sexism or throwaway comments or maybe touching women, inappropriately in public settings, things like that. That's how we start to shrink that. And the fact is, boys are not born to be rapists or abusers. They absorb messages and things along the way. So the more we diffuse those messages and replace them with, more appropriate, healthy, respectful ones, that's really where men can absolutely contribute.
I read somewhere a man said he deliberately went out of his way to make women on the street that he didn't know feel safe by just crossing over to the other side of the road if he saw them coming, or not going around with a big hoodie, a hood up, like actually showing his face and not looking, I suppose, aggressive or scary.
Yeah, the crossing the road. The crossing the road is actually quite a common one, and that came up in the context of a lot of discussions after that particularly awful public murder of Aisling Murphy. Was if somebody's walking behind you, of course you are going to be. That women were saying, being vigilant. People out running as well. And really tragically, I know, and I still meet women who say since Aisling Murphy was murdered, I don't go running on my own anymore. Which is just horrendous. The most freeing thing, a healthy, wonderful, healthful activity, and women not doing it because they think, I could get attacked, which is just awful.
It is. It's terrible. One last thing that I just wanted to maybe dip into a little bit now. It's nuanced on it. We could probably have a whole podcast on it, but I did want to talk about it because that is who I am. And it's a bit of a taboo subject. So, human nature, and this isn't often spoken about, in times of war, men of all creeds and races, they commit horrific crimes. They rape, they murder. And men in positions of power can do this too. So does power corrupt men?
Ooh, does power corrupt men? Well, I mean, what's that phrase? Power corrupts absolutely. I think when we're talking about sexual violence in the context of conflict and also migration, women's experience of conflict and of precarious migration, which is often as a result of conflict or sometimes environmental disaster, is that sexual violence is a spectre that is constant. And exploitation of vulnerability is something that certain people will actively seek to do. So there is a proportion of men who will actively seek to exploit vulnerability, and that might be to sexually extort vulnerable people, including children. I mean, we've seen aid workers in some countries in Haiti exploiting vulnerability. It is about power. It is about entitlement. It is about a lack of regard and respect for people as equals who have human rights. So sexual violence and sexual exploitation are fundamentally rooted in that same sense of entitlement. It is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. Again, not all men, but men who will seek to do it will seek out circumstances in which they can do it. So those who are particularly motivated will do so. In migration, one of the things that people often don't know is that women engaging in precarious migration pathways and girls often will consciously start taking contraceptive pills for the journey, because they know the likelihood that they will be raped is extremely high. So you have women arriving here, girls sometimes, who have come from areas where rape has been used as a weapon of war, who have then also been subjected to rape in transit by the traffickers, by the smugglers, by other migrants, because they are precarious and vulnerable. And then they get here and they're completely traumatized, and they are, going to direct provision situations. So we need to look at that. Losing your home, losing other family members to violence, that's something obviously that affects men deeply. But the sexual violence component is hugely disproportionately an additional factor for women. And in conflict as a weapon of war, it is used actively for ethnic cleansing. It is used actively to punish, degrade, humiliate, and, as I say, ethnically cleanse by basically, through, causing pregnancies amongst the target population by the invading population or by conflicting tribes, whatever it may be, is that women's bodies become the site of war in that situation. And it is about power and it is about control.
God, it seems like a really depressing note to end on. But
yes,
I don't think
find something else.
Well, do you know what? My something else to end on is my 2 questions that I ask everyone, because this can be quite uplifting then, because this wasn't an easy conversation, but I think it was a conversation that we needed to have, because I think people need to know the reality of what's going on in Ireland. To less of an extent, the rest of the world. Obviously, the rest of the world is very important, but even on our own doorstep, in our own community, and what we can probably do to reach out to help people like you and organisations like you. So anyway, I'll stop rambling. What advice would you give young people today, Sarah?
Don't be so hard on yourself. And always remember that the way somebody else looks outside is never telling you how they feel inside. The way you might be, all tangled up inside and you have a straight face. Just remember everyone else is the same. And please don't be so hard on yourself.
And what is the meaning of life?
Oh, God. If I had the answer to that now, I think I'd be doing something very different. I don't know. I slightly sidestepping the question. I think we only have one life, so all we can do is live it the best we can. That's really it.
Sarah, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I know that our conversation today will have helped many people. And thanks so much for joining me and giving me your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a million.